Montana Territory, 1885. The wind swept across the rolling plains like a vengeful spirit, rattling the shutters of Thornbrook's only general store as 20-year-old Tabitha Ellis tightened her grip on the wagon reins. The sky hung low and threatening, pregnant with the promise of an early spring storm that would turn the roads to mud and make her 5-mile journey back to her homestead nearly impossible. But like everything else since Pa's passing 3 months prior, she would face it alone. "You ought to wait it out, Miss Ellis," called Mr. Peterson from the store porch. "That sky's fixing to open up something fierce." Tabitha adjusted her simple blue calico dress beneath her worn wool coat and squared her shoulders. "Can't afford to, Mr. Peterson. Cattle won't feed themselves, and there's no one else to do it." That was the truth that had been hammered into her since childhood on this unforgiving frontier. Survival demanded strength, and weakness was a luxury she couldn't afford. Her father's words echoed in her mind. "This land takes everything you've got, Tabby, and then demands more." She believed it with all her heart, especially now that she faced the impossible task of maintaining their small ranch alone. "The frontier waits for no one, and neither do I," she murmured, flicking the reins to set her wagon in motion. Her golden blonde hair, pulled back in a practical braid, whipped against her neck as the wind picked up. 20 years old, and already her hands were calloused like those of a woman twice her age. The loaded wagon creaked under supplies meant to last a month: flour, coffee, ammunition, and seed for spring planting. The homestead her father had carved from the wilderness was her responsibility now, though every banker in the county had made it clear they expected her to fail. A woman alone couldn't survive the Montana frontier. That's what they all believed. Some days, in her darkest moments, she believed it too. What Tabitha wanted was simple: to keep her father's dream alive, to hold onto the land he'd died for. What she couldn't admit, even to herself, was what she needed: someone to share the burden, to make the endless work meaningful beyond mere survival. As she guided the wagon out of town, she spotted a rider approaching from the opposite direction. He sat tall in the saddle with an easy grace that spoke of a lifetime spent on horseback. Despite herself, Tabitha found her gaze lingering on him longer than propriety allowed. Yates Bannon tipped his hat as he passed the young woman in the wagon. At 25, he'd seen enough of the frontier to know when someone was in over their head. The blonde woman's determined expression couldn't hide the exhaustion that shadowed her eyes, and those supplies looked like a month's worth for a family, not just one person. Yates had his own ghost that kept him moving from ranch to ranch, never settling. His parents' deaths in an Apache raid when he was 16 had taught him the cruelest lesson of the frontier: attachment only led to heartbreak. Better to drift, to work hard and keep to himself, than to build something that could be torn away. The scars on his soul ran deeper than the light stubble on his jawline, though his youthful, handsome features rarely betrayed the pain he carried. Reining in his chestnut gelding, he glanced back at the woman's wagon just as the first heavy drops of rain began to fall. Something in her solitary struggle stirred something he'd thought long dead. Before he could reconsider, he turned his horse around. The sky cracked open just as Tabitha reached the steepest hill on the road home. Fat raindrops quickly turned to sheets of water, and within minutes, the wheels began to sink into the softening earth. The horses strained against the suddenly heavy load, their hooves slipping in the mud. "Come on," she urged, her voice nearly lost in the downpour. "Just a little more." A crack of thunder spooked the team, and the wagon lurched sideways, tilting precariously as one wheel slid toward the ditch. Tabitha fought the reins, her arms burning with the effort, but the wagon continued its slow-motion slide toward disaster. "Need a hand, ma'am?" The voice came from behind her, shouted above the storm. The young cowboy she'd passed in town appeared beside the wagon, his broad-shouldered frame already soaked through. Without waiting for her answer, he dismounted and moved to the struggling horses, speaking low and calm despite the chaos. "I can manage," Tabitha insisted, even as rain plastered her hair to her face and her arms trembled with fatigue. "No doubt you can," he replied, not arguing but not leaving either. "Name's Yates Bannon. Been working at the Double Circle, but I'm between jobs at the moment." Before she could protest again, he'd unhitched his own horse and attached it to her team, adding much-needed strength. With his shoulder against the wagon wheel and his horse pulling alongside her team, they gradually worked the wagon back onto solid ground. By the time they crested the hill, both were mud-splattered and drenched to the bone. The rain showed no sign of letting up. "Your place far?" he asked, water dripping from the brim of his hat. "Another 3 miles," Tabitha admitted, knowing the road ahead would be even worse. Yates nodded, his green eyes assessing the situation. "We'll make it, Miss Ellis." "Tabitha Ellis." She hesitated, then added, "My father's place. He passed this winter." Something flickered in Yates' expression, recognition of her situation, perhaps, or memory of his own losses. "Then we'd best get you home, Miss Ellis. Your cattle won't feed themselves." The simple acknowledgement of her responsibilities, without pity or judgment, caught Tabitha off guard. For the first time since her father's death, someone saw her burden without immediately suggesting she abandon it. The journey to the Ellis homestead took twice as long as it should have, with Yates walking beside the team, guiding them through the worst of the mud. By the time the modest cabin came into view, twilight was settling across the land, and the rain had finally slowed to a gentle patter. The small ranch was tidy but showed signs of neglect that only a woman working alone could be forgiven. A fence section needed mending, and the barn roof had a patch that wouldn't last another winter. "You should stay until morning," Tabitha said as they unhitched the team in the barn. "The creek floods in weather like this. You won't make it back to town tonight." Yates hesitated, his rule of never getting too close to anyone warring with practicality. "I can bed down in the barn." "Nonsense," she replied with unexpected firmness. "Pa would turn in his grave if I let anyone who helped his daughter sleep with the horses. There's stew left from yesterday, and the spare room is clean enough." As they settled into the small cabin, an awkward silence fell between them. Tabitha busied herself with the fire and reheating the stew, while Yates removed his muddy boots and hung his soaked coat by the stove. "Been managing all this yourself?" he asked finally, looking around the cabin that showed signs of both care and overwhelm. Mended curtains alongside stacked papers and accounts that needed attention. "Since December," she answered, her back to him as she stirred the pot. "Pa always said Ellis land would stay Ellis land. That's a heavy promise to keep alone." Tabitha stiffened. "I'm not afraid of hard work, Mr. Bannon." "Never suggested you were." He leaned against the rough-hewn table. "But even the strongest horse needs rest, Miss Ellis." Their eyes met across the small room, and for a moment, something passed between them, recognition of kindred spirits who understood loss and the harsh demands of frontier survival. The moment broke when a section of the ceiling chose that instant to give way, sending a cascade of water onto the kitchen table. Tabitha grabbed a bucket, her face flushing with embarrassment and frustration. "Been meaning to fix that," she muttered, positioning the bucket under the steady drip. Without comment, Yates took another bucket and placed it under a second leak that had formed. "Roof's a 2-person job," he observed mildly. "So's a ranch." Morning brought clear skies and the revelation of storm damage across the small ranch. Fencing was down where the creek had overflowed, and 2 calves had wandered dangerously close to the flooded lowlands. Tabitha rose before dawn, determined to handle everything before her unexpected guest awakened. To her surprise, she found Yates already outside, mending the chicken coop that had partially collapsed during the night. "You don't have to do that," she called, marching toward him with a mixture of gratitude and pride-fueled irritation. Yates glanced up, hammer in hand. "Morning to you too, Miss Ellis. I didn't invite you to stay so you could do my chores." "No, you invited me to stay because the creek flooded," he replied evenly, driving another nail with practiced efficiency. "And since it's still flooded, thought I might make myself useful." His logic was irrefutable, which only increased Tabitha's discomfort. She wasn't accustomed to help, not since Pa died. The neighboring ranches had sent men to help with the burial, but afterwards, they disappeared, assuming the Ellis place would soon be up for sale. "I've got to check the north pasture," she said instead of arguing further. 2 calves were missing at the evening count. Yates set down his hammer. "I'll saddle the horses." The simple statement, not offering to go instead of her, but to go with her, caught Tabitha off guard again. Before she could formulate a response, he was walking toward the barn, his long strides eating up the distance. They rode out together as the sun crested the eastern hills, painting the dew-covered grass in shades of gold. Despite her determination to maintain her independence, Tabitha found herself stealing glances at the young cowboy beside her. His profile was strong but gentle, with none of the hardened edges she'd come to expect from men who worked the frontier. "What brings you to Thornbrook?" she asked finally, breaking the comfortable silence. "Not much work this time of year." Yates adjusted his hat against the morning sun. "Been drifting since I was 16. Parents had a small place in Arizona territory until Apaches came through." The simple statement, delivered without self-pity, made Tabitha's throat tighten. "I'm sorry." He shrugged one shoulder. "Frontier teaches hard lessons. I learned not to put down roots. Makes it easier when it's time to move on." "And when is it time to move on, Mr. Bannon?" His gaze met hers, steady and unexpectedly vulnerable. "Before you care too much about staying." Something in his words resonated with the walls Tabitha had built around her own heart. Walls that protected her from the crushing weight of loneliness that threatened to overwhelm her when she lay awake at night, listening to the wind howl around the cabin's eaves. They found the calves stranded on a small rise surrounded by floodwater, bawling pitifully for their mothers. The rescue required both of them, Yates wading through chest-deep water to reach the frightened animals, and Tabitha guiding them back to solid ground with a rope. When the last calf was safely returned to the herd, both Tabitha and Yates were soaked and mud-splattered again, but laughing with the relief of a crisis averted. "We make a good team, Miss Ellis," Yates said, wiping mud from his face. The simple truth of the statement hung between them, challenging everything Tabitha had told herself about her ability to manage alone. The creek remained high for 3 days, and each morning Tabitha expected Yates to announce his departure. Each morning, instead, he found another task that needed attention: the roof, the fence line, the broken plow that had defeated her attempts at repair. On the third evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in magnificent shades of orange and purple, Tabitha finally asked the question that had been building inside her. "Why are you still here, Mr. Bannon?" Yates was silent for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but certain. "Because you remind me of what I've been running from." "And what's that?" He turned to face her, his expression open in a way that made her heart quicken. "The possibility that some things are worth the risk of losing them." The confession hung in the air between them, charged with meaning neither was ready to fully acknowledge. Tabitha looked away first, her fingers nervously tracing the wooden arm of her chair. "The creek will be passable tomorrow," she said, unable to voice the complex emotions his words had stirred. Yates nodded, understanding her retreat. "Then I should be on my way." The declaration should have brought relief. A return to the independence she'd convinced herself was all she wanted. Instead, it left an ache in Tabitha's chest that no amount of frontier stoicism could disguise. True to his word, Yates prepared to leave the following morning. He refused payment for his help, asking only for supplies enough to reach the next town. "I could use help through calving season," Tabitha blurted as he tightened the cinch on his saddle. The words surprised her as much as him. "I can pay fair wages, not much, but enough." Yates' hands stilled on the leather straps. "Thought you preferred managing alone, Miss Ellis." "I do. I mean," she took a deep breath, struggling with the admission, "the ranch needs more than one pair of hands. That's just practical sense." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Practical sense," he repeated. "Nothing more." Heat rose in Tabitha's cheeks. "The bunkhouse needs work, but it's dry enough." It wasn't an answer to his question, but Yates accepted it with a nod. "I'll stay through calving then, as your hired hand." The boundaries established, Tabitha felt on firmer ground. This wasn't about companionship or the way her pulse quickened when he smiled. It was a business arrangement, nothing more. But as the days stretched into weeks, those boundaries began to blur. Meals taken together led to conversations that extended long after the dishes were cleared. Work shared led to a rhythm of cooperation that felt as natural as breathing. And stories exchanged around the evening fire gradually revealed the broken pieces each carried, and how those pieces might fit together to create something stronger than either had alone. Spring advanced across the land, bringing new calves, greening pastures, and tender shoots in the kitchen garden Yates helped Tabitha expand. With each passing day, the Ellis Ranch looked less like a homestead on the verge of failure and more like a place with a future. What neither acknowledged was how that future had begun to include both of them in ways neither had planned. The letter arrived with Thornbrook's monthly mail delivery, carried out to the ranch by young Tommy Peterson, who eagerly accepted Tabitha's offer of fresh cookies before racing back to town. The heavy parchment envelope bore an official seal that made Tabitha's stomach twist with apprehension. She set it aside until after dinner, when she and Yates had settled into their customary places by the fire. "Bad news?" Yates asked, noting her tension as she finally broke the seal. "Don't know yet," she replied, unfolding the document with trembling fingers. As she read, the color drained from her face. "What is it?" Yates moved to her side, his concern evident. Tabitha stared at the paper, her voice hollow when she finally spoke. "The bank is calling in Pa's loan. They say," she swallowed hard. "They say I've failed to demonstrate the property can be maintained under my management. I have 30 days to pay in full or forfeit the land." Yates took the letter, his expression darkening as he read. "This is Bradford's work. He's been trying to expand his holdings in this valley for years." "How do you know that?" "Men talk in saloons," Yates said grimly. "Bradford's been boasting about how he'll own the whole eastern valley by summer's end. Your place is the missing piece." Tabitha stood, pacing the small room with growing agitation. "I can't lose this land, Yates. It's all I have left of Pa, of my family." Her voice cracked on the last word, the first real sign of vulnerability she'd shown since he'd known her. Without thinking, Yates crossed to her, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "You won't lose it. We'll figure something out." The "we" hung between them, significant and unexamined. Tabitha looked up at him, seeing not just the hired hand who'd become essential to the ranch's operation, but the man who'd somehow become essential to her. "Why do you care what happens to this place?" she whispered. "To me?" Instead of answering with words, Yates lowered his head and kissed her, tentatively at first, then with growing certainty as she responded. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing unsteadily, startled by the intensity of feelings they'd been carefully avoiding acknowledging. "I care," he said simply, "because somewhere between that muddy road and today, you became the home I never thought I'd have again." The confession should have been everything Tabitha wanted to hear, but the letter's threat cast a shadow over the moment. She stepped back, confusion and fear warring with newfound hope. "I have to save the ranch," she said, returning to practical matters. "The spring cattle sale won't bring enough to cover the loan." Yates respected her retreat, though his eyes still held the warmth of the moment they'd shared. "Then we'll find another way." The solution came from an unexpected source. While in town seeking legal advice, Yates encountered a cattle buyer from Chicago looking to establish new supply lines for the growing meatpacking industry. "They need reliable suppliers," Yates explained excitedly when he returned to the ranch. "If we can prove the Ellis Ranch can provide quality stock consistently, they're willing to sign a 5-year contract, with an advance payment large enough to satisfy the bank." "If we can prove," Tabitha repeated, catching the word that revealed how thoroughly Yates had tied his future to hers. He faltered, suddenly uncertain. "I meant, if you can prove. It's your ranch." Tabitha took a deep breath, finally giving voice to what had been building between them for weeks. "Is it? Or is it becoming ours?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither had dared address directly. Before Yates could answer, hoofbeats sounded in the yard. Through the window, they spotted Bradford himself, flanked by 2 of his men, dismounting by the corral. "I'll handle this," Tabitha said, squaring her shoulders. Yates touched her arm. "We'll handle it together." Bradford's smile was all predatory satisfaction as Tabitha and Yates emerged from the cabin. In his 40s, with the well-fed look of a man who'd prospered through others' misfortunes, he removed his hat with mocking politeness. "Miss Ellis, I see you found some help around the place. Awful generous of young Bannon here, considering." "Considering what, Mr. Bradford?" Tabitha asked, her voice steady despite the tension radiating from Yates beside her. Bradford's smile widened. "Why, considering his family history with your father." The statement fell like a stone between them. Tabitha turned to Yates, whose face had gone rigid with what looked like guilt or shock. "What is he talking about?" she demanded. Bradford answered before Yates could speak. "You mean he hasn't told you? Your father's loan, the very one I now hold, was originally made to assist the Bannon family after that unfortunate business in Arizona. When they couldn't repay, your father assumed the debt. Quite the noble gesture, considering it bankrupted him. The revelation hit Tabitha like a physical blow. She stared at Yates, waiting for him to deny it, to explain that Bradford was lying to drive a wedge between them. But Yates' expression confirmed the truth before he spoke. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "Not until last week, when I saw the original loan papers in town. And you didn't tell me?" The betrayal stung worse than the news itself. "I was trying to find a solution first." Bradford cleared his throat, clearly enjoying the drama unfolding. "Touching as this is, I came to make you a fair offer, Miss Ellis. I'll forgive the loan entirely in exchange for a clear deed to the property. You can take your personal belongings, of course." Tabitha barely heard him, still reeling from Yates' deception. All these weeks, he'd been working alongside her, gaining her trust, her heart, while keeping this vital connection hidden. "I need you to leave," she said, her voice wooden. "Both of you." Bradford tipped his hat. "Think about my offer, Miss Ellis. It's more generous than you'll get from anyone else." As Bradford and his men rode away, Tabitha turned back to the cabin without looking at Yates. He followed her inside, his normally confident stride hesitant. "Tabitha, please. Let me explain." She whirled to face him, anger and hurt breaking through her careful composure. "Explain what? That you've been lying to me for months? That you knew about the connection to my father and said nothing?" "I only discovered the truth last week," Yates insisted. "I've been trying to find a way to make it right." "By keeping me in the dark? By letting me believe?" She cut herself off, unable to articulate what she'd begun to believe about him, about them. Yates stepped closer, his eyes pleading for understanding. "I was ashamed. My father's debt destroyed your family, and I didn't know how to tell you that. So instead you pretended to care about the ranch. About me." His expression hardened at that. "I never pretended anything, Tabitha. Everything I feel for you is real." She turned away, unable to bear the intensity in his gaze. "I think you should go, Mr. Bannon." The formality was a deliberate barrier, and Yates flinched as if she'd struck him. "If that's what you want." "It is." He paused at the door, silhouetted against the afternoon sun. "For what it's worth, I was coming back. All those years of drifting, and I was finally coming back to face my family's past. That's why I was in Thornbrook in the first place." With that, he was gone, leaving Tabitha alone with the wreckage of what she'd begun to hope might be a future with him. The days that followed were the loneliest of Tabitha's life. The ranch, which had seemed manageable with Yates beside her, now loomed as an impossible burden. Tasks that they had tackled together took twice as long alone, and each night she collapsed into exhausted sleep, too tired even to examine the ache in her heart. A week after Yates' departure, Tabitha rode into Thornbrook with Bradford's offer weighing heavily on her mind. The bank had made it clear they would accept no extensions or partial payments. Without the cattle contract Yates had been negotiating, she had no way to raise the necessary funds in time. As she tied her horse outside the bank, a commotion down the street caught her attention. A crowd had gathered outside the telegraph office, where the operator was posting a notice. Drawing closer, Tabitha overheard fragments of excited conversation. "Biggest cattle deal in territory history. Chicago buyers. 5-year contract." Pushing through to read the notice, Tabitha felt her heart skip. The announcement detailed the establishment of a new beef supply route from Montana to Chicago, with the Ellis Ranch named as the primary supplier. The terms matched exactly what Yates had described, including an advance payment to be made immediately upon contract signing. "He did it," she whispered, stunned by the realization that even after she'd sent him away, Yates had completed the negotiations that would save her ranch. Racing to the saloon where travelers typically stayed, Tabitha asked after Yates only to learn he'd left town that morning. The bartender handed her an envelope. "Said you might come looking. Asked me to give you this." Inside was the deed to her ranch, the loan marked "paid in full," along with a brief note in Yates' hand. "The debt my family owed yours is finally repaid. The cattle contract is legitimate. The buyer was impressed with the quality of your stock. Your father would be proud of what you've built. I'm sorry I wasn't honest sooner. YB." There was no mention of his feelings for her or any request to return. He had given her exactly what she needed, the means to keep her ranch and her independence, while asking nothing in return. For 3 days, Tabitha wrestled with pride and longing, anger and gratitude. The ranch was secure now, the future she'd fought for within reach. Yet the victory felt hollow without Yates to share it. On the fourth day, a spring storm rolled in, reminiscent of the one that had first brought Yates to her door. As thunder cracked overhead and rain lashed the windows, Tabitha made her decision. Saddling her horse in the downpour, she rode out, following instinct and fragments of conversations where Yates had mentioned places he'd worked. The trail led her to a lined shack on the far edge of Bradford's property, neutral ground where cowboys from different ranches often gathered during roundup season. Through the driving rain, she spotted a lone figure on the porch, tall and unmistakable even at a distance. Her heart hammered as she approached, suddenly uncertain of her welcome. Yates stood as she dismounted, his expression carefully neutral. "Miss Ellis, didn't expect to see you in this weather." The formality cut deeper than she'd anticipated. Dripping wet and suddenly tongue-tied, Tabitha stood before him, searching for the words she'd rehearsed on the ride. "You paid off my father's loan," she said finally, "and secured the cattle contract. It was the right thing to do." Was that all it was? The right thing? Something flickered in his eyes. Hope, quickly suppressed. What else would it be? Tabitha stepped closer, rain streaming down her face, mingling with tears she could no longer contain. "You told me once that the frontier taught you not to put down roots, that it's easier to leave before you care too much about staying." "I remember," he said softly. "I've been trying to be strong since Pa died, trying to prove I don't need anyone, that I can handle everything alone." Her voice broke. "But I'm tired of being strong, Yates. I'm tired of pretending I don't need you." The admission cost her every ounce of pride she'd clung to, but as the words left her lips, she felt lighter than she had in months. Yates closed the distance between them in 2 strides, his hands cradling her face as if she were made of porcelain. "You don't have to be strong today," he whispered, "or any day you don't want to be." The words, so simple, so profound in their understanding of what she truly needed, undid the last of her resistance. Tabitha leaned into his embrace, finally allowing herself to accept the support she'd been denying for so long. "I want you to come home," she said against his chest. "Not as my hired hand, as my partner. In everything." Yates drew back just enough to meet her gaze, his own vulnerability finally unmasked. "Are you sure? There's still so much you don't know about me." "Then tell me. We have time now." His smile broke through like sunshine after the storm. "Partner, huh?" "Partner," she confirmed, "though I was hoping for husband, eventually." The declaration surprised them both, but Yates recovered quickly, his laugh rich with joy as he lifted her off her feet in an embrace that promised he'd never let go again. "I think that can be arranged, Miss Ellis." Montana Territory, 1886. The morning sunlight streamed through the new curtains in the Ellis, now Yates Bannon, ranch house, falling across the expanded kitchen table where breakfast dishes from the morning meal still sat. Through the open window came the sounds of construction as the bunkhouse was enlarged to accommodate the additional hands needed for the expanding cattle operation. Tabitha stood on the porch, watching as Yates demonstrated roping techniques to 12-year-old Danny Williams, an orphan from town who'd come to work as a stable boy and found a family instead. Her hand rested lightly on her stomach, where the first subtle signs of the child they'd created were beginning to show. The past year had transformed not just the ranch, but Tabitha herself. The fierce independence that had been her shield against a harsh world had softened into something stronger. The knowledge that true strength came not from standing alone, but from having someone to lean on when the burden grew too heavy. Yates looked up, catching her gaze across the yard. His smile, still boyish despite the responsibilities he'd assumed, warmed her from the inside out. He excused himself from Danny and crossed to join her on the porch, his arms sliding naturally around her waist. "Everything all right?" he asked, noting her contemplative expression. Tabitha leaned into his embrace, marveling at how easily she'd learned to accept support after a lifetime of self-reliance. "Just thinking about how wrong Pa was," she replied. "He always said the frontier takes everything you have and demands more. But he never understood what it gives back." Yates pressed a kiss to her temple. "And what's that?" Tabitha turned in his arms, her face tilted up to his. "The chance to build something stronger than what you lost. The chance to find home in someone else." As their lips met in a kiss that promised a lifetime of shared burdens and shared joys, Tabitha knew she'd never have to be strong alone again. The frontier that had taken so much from both of them had, in the end, given them the greatest gift of all, each other.